The morning had started crisp and bright, the kind of winter air that stung the lungs but carried no hint of danger. Children trudged down dirt roads toward one-room schoolhouses, their laughter trailing behind them in frosty clouds. Farmers checked livestock pens and leaned on fences, scanning skies that seemed clear, if pale. By midday, the sun dulled and the horizon thickened with haze. Then came the first sharp gust, cold, unnatural, carrying with it a fine powder that stung eyes and cheeks. In a matter of minutes, the wind was howling, snow was slicing sideways, and the world turned white. Visibility collapsed to nothing. Men who had walked a road every day of their lives could no longer see the barn across the yard. Children leaving school could not find the path home. The storm had arrived without warning, and it would kill hundreds before it released its grip. It was January 12, 1888, remembered across the plains as the Schoolchildren's blizzard. The Dakotas, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Iowa had endured a stretch of unusually mild weather leading up to that day. Temperatures had risen above freezing, unusual for the season, and settlers welcomed the reprieve. Many had gone about their work lightly dressed, coats unbuttoned or left behind. Children wore sweaters instead of heavy wool, glad for the break in the cold. That change lulled families into a false sense of security. When the blizzard hit, they were unprepared for the violence of what swept across the plains. The storm built out of the northern Rockies, a massive front of Arctic air colliding with warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico. When the system struck the Great Plains, it turned the flat expanse into a funnel of destruction. Winds reached hurricane force. Temperatures plummeted in minutes, falling nearly 50 degrees as the Arctic air drove south. Snow came fine and dense, carried in sheets by the gale, turning the daylight into a gray blindness. It wasn't the heavy snow that buried houses. It was the blinding speed of the storm, the sudden drop in temperature, and the sheer force of the wind that trapped people where they stood. The timing made it even worse. Midday, children were in classrooms scattered across the prairies, often in simple wooden structures with little insulation. When the storm struck, teachers faced impossible choices. Some kept their students inside, praying the storm would pass quickly. Others believed parents expected their children home and dismissed them, only to watch in horror as children walked into the white void and disappeared. Many never made it back. Stories later told of frozen bodies found just yards from the door, lost in the swirl, unable to find the schoolhouse again once they stepped into the storm. Farmers were caught in the open, some tending livestock, others hauling supplies. Wagons overturned as oxen and horses panicked in the wind. Families who lived in sod houses huddled inside, their walls trembling under the force of the storm. Roofs ripped away, snow poured in, and lanterns sputtered out. The blizzard roared for hours, leaving entire communities paralyzed, unable to send help, unable even to know who was still alive beyond their own doors. Telegraph wires snapped, fences disappeared under drifts, and landmarks that settlers relied on for direction vanished completely. By nightfall, the temperatures had plunged below zero. Those still outside had little chance. Children who had been caught between home and school curled against fence posts or in shallow ditches, overcome by exhaustion and cold. Some tried to follow familiar landmarks, fences, creeks, or wagon tracks, but the storm swallowed every sign of direction. Families waiting at home could do nothing but pray, listening for voices carried on the wind and knowing their children might already be lost in the storm's grip. When morning came on January 13th, the devastation revealed itself in pieces. Silence lay heavy over the frozen landscape, broken only by the creak of ice and the distant lowing of cattle trapped in drifts. Neighbors opened their doors to a changed world. Bodies were found in fields and along roads, some just steps from safety. Parents carried the frozen forms of children back to homes that were no longer warm enough to hold them. School teachers were discovered still clutching students in their arms, having tried to shield them until the end. Livestock losses were staggering, with cattle and horses buried in snowbanks or frozen standing where they had huddled against the wind. The death toll was staggering for such a sparsely settled region. At least 235 people perished, though some estimates placed the number higher when isolated homesteads were counted in the weeks that followed. The tragedy was compounded by the number of children among the dead. Newspapers across the country printed stories of the storm, and it became known as one of the most sudden and deadly blizzards in American history. Families who had crossed oceans and prairies to start new lives were forced to bury sons and daughters in frozen ground. The blizzard reshaped the way settlers approached survival on the frontier. Communities built stronger schoolhouses, better insulated and stocked with supplies. Teachers were given clearer instructions never to dismiss students in sudden storms. Families stored food, coal, and water within reach in case they were trapped indoors for days. Meteorology was still in its infancy, but the tragedy highlighted the desperate need for more accurate weather forecasting. The U.S. Army Signal Corps, then responsible for weather reports, came under scrutiny, and it pushed forward improvements in storm warnings. But in 1888, such systems were too limited to save those caught unaware on the plains. For those who lived through it, the memory never left. Survivors described the sound of the storm as a living thing, a force that roared and screamed and left them helpless. They spoke of the way snow packed into nostrils and mouths, suffocating as much as freezing. They remembered the cries that drifted in the wind and then fell silent. The Great Blizzard of 1888 became part of frontier lore, not only for its destruction, but for the resilience of those who rebuilt after it. Yet for the families who buried children, it was not history. It was a wound carved into the heart of their homesteads, a loss carried through generations. The storm stands as a stark reminder of the fragile balance settlers lived with on the open plains. The land offered opportunity, but it demanded everything in return. For many, that price came on a single day in January 1888, when a clear morning turned into a deadly white wall, and the prairie claimed its toll in lives cut short. It remains one of the most haunting events of America's frontier history, a day when nature proved its power and settlers learned again that survival could never be taken for granted. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.